Lenovo just made a move that could shake the PC industry. And if the headlines are to be believed, Bill Gates isn't happy. Now let's slow down for a second. Is Bill Gates personally furious? Probably not pacing around a room yelling, but is Microsoft concerned when one of the world's largest PC manufacturers starts leaning harder into Linux? Absolutely. Because this isn't just about one laptop. This is about something much bigger. For decades, Windows has been the default operating system for mainstream PCs. You buy a laptop, you expect Windows. That's the ecosystem. Manufacturers build around it. Businesses standardize around it. Consumers assume it. So when Lenovo, one of the largest PC makers on the planet, expands its Linux offerings or shifts certain product lines toward Linux pre-installs, it sends a signal, a very loud one. The question is, why would they do that? Windows has dominated the desktop for years. Right. It's familiar. It's widely supported. It's deeply integrated into corporate environments. So what's changing? The first factor is cost. Windows licenses are not free for manufacturers. Every pre-installed copy of Windows carries a licensing fee. Multiply that by millions of devices, and you're talking serious money. Linux? Free. Open source. No per-device license cost. For a company operating at global scale, shaving even small costs per unit becomes massive. But this isn't just about saving money. It's also about control. When manufacturers ship Windows, they're tied into Microsoft's update cycles, system requirements, and ecosystem decisions. If Microsoft changes hardware requirements, like they did with Windows 11, and TPM manufacturers have to adapt. If Microsoft pushes certain integrations, telemetry systems, or cloud dependencies, OEMs don't get much say with Linux. Manufacturers gain flexibility. They can customize. They can optimize. They can control the user experience more directly. That's powerful. Now, let's talk technical reasons. Linux has matured. This isn't 2005 Linux. Modern distributions are stable, polished, enterprise-ready. Driver support has improved dramatically. Hardware compatibility is stronger. Corporate Linux deployments are already common on servers and increasingly on desktops. Expanding that into more consumer or workstation offerings isn't as radical as it might sound. But here's where it gets interesting. What if this isn't just about Linux being good enough? What if it's about Windows becoming more expensive? Not just financially, but strategically. Windows increasingly pushes cloud integration, Microsoft accounts, subscription services, AI integrations. For consumers, that might be convenient. For manufacturers and certain enterprise customers, that can feel like dependency. Linux offers something different. No forced accounts, no built-in corporate ecosystem lock-in, no licensing negotiations, every hardware cycle. That independence is attractive. Now, does this mean Windows is collapsing? No. Windows still dominates the desktop market. But major manufacturers experimenting more aggressively with Linux tells us something important. The monopoly mindset is fading. And here's the real tension. If more manufacturers ship Linux pre-installed, even in niche segments, developers, engineers, privacy-focused consumers, that chips away at Windows' automatic default status, and once users realize they have a choice, that's when things shift. Because historically, one of Linux's biggest barriers wasn't capability, it was availability. If your laptop ships with Windows by default, that's what you use. If Linux starts shipping by default on certain models, adoption becomes easier. That's where the story gets bigger than Bill Gates. This is about ecosystem power. Who controls the platform? Who controls updates? Who controls licensing? And who controls the future of the PC? But we're not done yet, because there are financial implications, strategic implications, and industry ripple effects that go far beyond one headline. Let's break those down next. Now let's talk about the financial side, because this is where things get really interesting. When a company like Lenovo ships millions of devices every year, even small cost differences matter. Windows licensing isn't free. OEM's original equipment manufacturers pay Microsoft for every copy of Windows pre-installed on a device. Exact numbers vary depending on contracts and editions, but at scale, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars over time. And now imagine reducing that dependency. If Lenovo ships certain models with Linux instead of Windows, those license fees disappear. That improves margins, or it allows them to offer lower prices and compete more aggressively. And in a market where laptop profit margins are already tight, every dollar counts. But it's not just about licensing. There's also strategic leverage. If a manufacturer becomes too dependent on one operating system vendor, that vendor has power. Power over requirements, power over timelines, power over integration rules. We saw this with Windows 11's hardware requirements. When Microsoft pushed TPM 2.0 requirements and stricter hardware standards, millions of perfectly functional PCs were suddenly labeled unsupported. That affects consumers, but it also affects manufacturers. Inventory planning becomes complicated. Support policies shift. Product life cycles shorten. Linux doesn't enforce those same centralized requirements. Linux distribution can run on older hardware far longer. That flexibility extends product life. And in a world where sustainability and waste are growing concerns, longer device support becomes a selling point. Now let's look at enterprise customers. Large companies often deploy fleets of laptops. Many of them already use Linux on servers. Some use Linux workstations for development. If Lenovo offers enterprise-ready Linux machines pre-installed, that reduces friction for those customers. No need to wipe Windows. No need to reimage systems. No need to negotiate extra licensing terms. That's convenient. And convenience drives adoption. But here's another angle that people don't talk about enough. Control over the user experience. When manufacturers ship Windows, they often preload extra software, what people call bloatware. But even then, Microsoft controls the core experience. Updates roll out on Microsoft's schedule. System UI changes come from Microsoft. Built-in services connect back to Microsoft. Manufacturers don't control that layer. With Linux, especially when working with open-source communities or enterprise vendors, OEMs can customize more deeply. They can tune performance, adjust default settings, optimize for specific hardware. It's attractive if you want differentiation. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Does this mean Lenovo is abandoning Windows entirely? No. Windows remains dominant in consumer markets, especially for gaming and corporate environments. But diversification is powerful. If Lenovo strengthens its Linux portfolio, it gains negotiation leverage with Microsoft. It sends a message: we have options, and options shift power dynamics. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. In the server world, Linux gradually overtook proprietary systems because it was flexible, cost-effective, and community-driven. Windows still plays a role, but it's not the only option. On the desktop, Windows has been insulated by habit and pre-installed dominance. But if OEMs expand Linux offerings meaningfully, that insulation weakens. Now here's the key question. Will average consumers choose Linux laptops? Right now, maybe not in huge numbers, but developers, engineers, privacy-focused users, and cost-sensitive markets might. And adoption doesn't have to be massive to matter. Even small percentage shifts can influence strategy. Because Microsoft's dominance relies on default status, once alternatives become visible and accessible, the conversation changes. This isn't about Bill Gates being angry. It's about ecosystem competition. And when competition increases, innovation accelerates. But there are still risks and limitations to consider. And we need to talk about whether Linux can realistically scale on mainstream consumer hardware. That's where the story gets even more interesting. So now the big question. Can Linux actually scale on mainstream consumer laptops? Because it's one thing to offer Linux models, it's another thing for everyday buyers to choose them. For years, Linux adoption on desktops has faced three main barriers: familiarity, software compatibility, perception. Let's start with familiarity. Most consumers walk into a store expecting Windows. Schools teach Windows. Offices use Windows. Friends and family know Windows. Comfort matters. If someone buys a laptop and sees a different interface, even if it's simple, they may hesitate. That's a psychological barrier, not a technical one. Modern Linux desktops are polished, clean, easy to use. But default habits are powerful. Now let's talk software. For many users, the browser is everything. If Chrome runs, YouTube works, Netflix streams, and Office files open, that's enough. Linux handles all of that. Where friction appears is with very specific software, certain enterprise tools, some gaming titles, specialized Windows-only applications. If manufacturers push Linux into segments where compatibility isn't a major issue, like development machines, education devices, or budget laptops, adoption becomes easier. Now, let's talk perception. For years, Linux was viewed as for hackers or for tech people only. That reputation sticks. But the reality has changed. Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux, Mint, these distributions are user-friendly. They have graphical installers, app stores, automatic updates. The gap between Linux and Windows for everyday tasks is much smaller than most people realize. Which brings us back to Lenovo. If a major OEM promotes Linux machines confidently, not as experimental devices, but as first-class products, perception shifts, and perception influences demand. Now here's something important. This isn't necessarily about replacing Windows. It's about coexistence. The PC ecosystem doesn't have to be winner-take-all. Servers already run a mix of operating systems. Cloud environments do too. Desktops may move in that direction slowly. More choice means more competition. More competition means better pricing, better features, and better support across the board, and that benefits consumers. Now let's address the dramatic headline. Is Bill Gates furious? Probably not personally. But large-scale shifts toward Linux by major manufacturers absolutely get Microsoft's attention. Because Microsoft's power isn't just technical, it's structural. It relies on default installations, long-term enterprise contracts, and ecosystem lock-in. If those defaults start to diversify, the landscape changes. But change in tech is rarely explosive. It's gradual. Linux didn't take over servers overnight. It gained ground year by year. The same could happen on desktops, not through rebellion, but through availability. If more laptops ship with Linux pre-installed, some percentage of users will stick with it. Some will discover they don't need Windows as much as they thought. And over time, that reshapes expectations. The real story here isn't about anger, it's about options. When manufacturers have options, they gain leverage. When consumers have options, they gain control. And when control spreads, ecosystems become healthier. Will Linux dominate desktops tomorrow? No. But will its presence grow if companies like Lenovo continue expanding support? Very likely. And the moment Linux stops being the alternative and starts being one of the defaults, that's when the real shift begins.